That's your job, Rashad. It's 8:58. Are you a minute early? Oh, that's okay. Oh, wait, I guess you can send them what you want.
Passionate, outspoken, insightful. Ariva Martin is an award-winning civil rights attorney, best-selling author, legal commentator, and America's advocate. Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report.
Good morning and welcome to our viewers in the U.S. and around the world. To kick off this morning's broadcast, do me a favor. Please share the show with your online friends or start a viewing party. And remember, post a comment or a question. Your voice matters, and I want to hear from you. Social scientist and religious commentator Dr. Robert Jones's new book, White Too Long: The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, was released on July 28th. The book is filled with startling revelations that are going to make a lot of Christians uncomfortable. In the book, Mr. Jones, the CEO and founder of Public Religion Research Institute, blends church history, memoir, and contemporary public opinion surveys. Together, they make a clear and compelling case for why white American Christians need to reckon with their past and present attitudes towards race. According to Dr. Jones, it is impossible to talk about American Christianity without recognizing that racism helped shape the church and that white Christian identity in itself is directly connected to racist attitudes. Let's discuss. Welcome to the show, Dr. Robert Jones. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Jones, so much for joining me this morning. I was just fascinated when I read about your book and started to read excerpts from it. I just want to ask you, what prompted you to write this book?
Well, thanks you for having me on today. I'm glad to be here. It was a couple of things. I mean, one is in my day job, I spend a lot of time looking at current public opinion data and looking particularly at the role that religious America are the ways are the attitudes of religious Americans on a whole range of issues. And I just have been struck, particularly over the last 4 years or 5 years, at this pattern that I see in survey after survey, question after question. And what we end up seeing is that white Christians, and not just white evangelicals, I should say, that are heavily in the South, but also white mainline Protestants that tend to be more in the Midwest, and white Catholics tend to be more populous in the Northeast. But white Christians as a whole have a very difficult time seeing structural racism and hold more racist views compared to whites who are not Christian, whites who claim no religious affiliation. And it'd be one thing if I saw this once or twice, but again, just in survey after survey, year after year, this very persistent pattern. And then I should say that this book is also for me quite personal. I grew up in Mississippi as a Southern Baptist. I have a degree from a Southern Baptist college and a Southern Baptist seminary. So I grew up very much steeped in this world. And so this book, I think, is an attempt to really lay out what's going on. Why is it that we still see these attitudes? And so it's part history, part memoir, part social science. But the upshot really is that we still have a very big problem in the white Christian church, and this legacy of white supremacy from our history is still very much with us today.
So I want to talk a little about the growing up in the South, because you talk the book, as you described, is part memoir. It's about your family's history and your family's history with slavery in the South. So tell us a little about that history and how that history has informed some of the conclusions that you reach in the book.
Yeah. Well, I was that kid who was at church 5 times a week, growing up. I mean, I was active in the youth group. I was there all the time. And I think as an adult and reflecting back on that experience in the Deep South, one shocking, thing, to me as an adult to reflect back on it is that I cannot remember a single time hearing a sermon on civil rights, on the struggle for Black equality, on white Christians' role in slavery. And this is quite remarkable given that the Southern Baptist Convention, which is the denomination which I grew up, was explicitly founded to allow slave-owning missionaries to be sent out and be members in good standing of churches. I mean, that was the precipitating event in 1845. That was the founding event of the Southern Baptist Convention. And yet it wasn't until I was in my 20s as a seminary student that I heard anything about that. So I think this story and the entanglement of and the disfigurement, I would say, of white Christianity by white supremacy is a story that has that many white Christians, one, don't know, and these conversations are just barely beginning, I think, to be had.
Yeah, and I think what was fascinating, I grew up Catholic myself, and until probably an adult, I never saw an African American or any person of color in, the role as priest or brother or even as a nun. So when I was, reflecting on your book and thinking about my own upbringing as a Black Catholic in a predominantly white Catholic church, I was, reflecting on your comments about theology, and the whole theology you say of, Christianity turns a blind eye to concepts of racial justice. And help us understand, those of us who grew up, thinking that we were pretty progressive on issues, and as an African American, me having no choice but to be, because I was, subjected to some of the racism that you talk about in the book. But I think this is going to be shocking to a lot of people who think that they, are good Christians.
Yeah. Well, I think that it is the sense that I think most white Christians today and Christians in general think of themselves as good people who do good things, right? And there's certainly some truth to that. I mean, this book is not an anti-religious book. It's not an anti-Christian book. If anything, it's trying to call the Christian church back to a more faithful expression of itself and to disentangle itself from this legacy of white supremacy. But it's notable, so Catholicism, I think, is not one that people think of typically when you think about white supremacy. But, as late as the 1940s, Catholic churches in New York were requiring African Americans to come receive the Eucharist last after all the white Catholics came to the altar. They segregated white and Black Catholics in New York and put all African American Catholics in one parish, right? So that even Catholic schools that were open, there was one Catholic school open to African Americans, even in New York, right? This is not the Deep South. So I think this history is just barely below the surface. It has been repressed, I think, by white Christians in particular, because it doesn't fit this narrative that we like to tell about ourselves, that we're good people who do good things. But it doesn't really take that much to just spend a little bit of time and to understand a little bit of the history and to understand just how deeply this has been ingrained, really from the founding of the country going forward.
And you see symbols. We just showed a symbol of Ku Klux Klan members burning a cross. So help us understand even the symbolism of white supremacy, the cross. This religious symbol that is supposed to, stand for, righteousness and what's good, is used by these white supremacists as a method of intimidating and, invoking fear into African Americans in the South. So why the cross? Why did the Ku Klux Klan choose the cross as that symbol of hate and intimidation?
Yeah, well, I think many people don't really think about this as the KKK. They think of them as just a racist organization, but they were deeply Christian and Protestant. So it's important to remember they were not only anti-Black, they were anti-Jewish and anti-Catholic, right? And so it was a Protestant cross that they were burning, kind of setting a flame to declare really this dominance of white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christianity as the core of really what America should be about, and really who owned American society. And the reign of terror that they unleashed really was about, even in the wake of the loss in the Civil War, where slavery was abolished, white supremacy by no means was abolished by the Civil War. And this reign of terror to declare, well, we may have lost the war, but let there be no doubt that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christianity and this white identity as part of that is very much about the kind of America that we're enforcing. When we can't enforce it by law, we'll enforce it by terror.
And what about those white Christians that would say to you, Dr. Jones, that was then, and yes,
Yeah.
there is this history of racism and white supremacy associated with, the white church growing up, coming up out of the South. But today you have pastors like Joe Osteen who marched with Black Lives Matter protesters in Houston just in June, and others who have issued statements in support of Black Lives Matter. What would you say to those Christians that would say, that's our past, today is our future, and our future looks very different than our past?
Well, I think there's some very hopeful signs. I mean, even in my own state, home state of Mississippi, the Mississippi Baptist Convention actually called on the governor and the state legislature to remove the Confederate battle flag from its state flag just a few weeks ago. That's something I would have had a hard time imagining, even as I finished writing the book last year. So I think that's really notable. But here's the challenge: when a religion has grown up, as white Christianity in this country has, with an a priority commitment to white supremacy. And by that, I don't mean the KKK version of it. I mean to practices and beliefs that undergird the idea that white lives are more valuable than Black lives, right? And that society is organized in a way that lives out that truth, from laws to policies. I mean, these are things that have been baked into our institutions, right? Not just into one individual's belief system. And so it's a question of what we have inherited, right? We've inherited a religion that had this a priority commitment to valuing white lives over Black lives. And it's gotten so built in to our beliefs, our rituals, even our architecture, that untangling this is going to be quite a feat. And I think we really are tearing down these symbols out there, very, very important. But the other work that is to be done is beyond tearing down symbols to the Confederacy, is dismantling and toppling the white Christian theology and institutions that were built to justify that worldview in the first place.
And as much as I point to that example of Joe Osteen, I've also read other white evangelical Christians who have had a very difficult time with even saying the words Black Lives Matter, who get offended by it, who've not, spoken out against racial injustices, who deny that there is systemic racism that exists in this country today. So help us understand this dichotomy where we see someone as prominent as Joe Osteen, and we don't know, you can march with Black Lives Matter. I don't want to say that means he's an anti-racist. I don't know if he is or not, but we do know that there's a large group of white evangelical Christians who are having a really difficult time with this moment that we're in, this moment, where anti-racists and protesters have taken to the street after the murder of George Floyd, to really demand equality in this country. So why are white Christians, so many of them, still having issues with that?
Yeah. Well, I think it is because it goes much deeper than just the individual question of, do I hold racist views toward a particular, African Americans in my own life? It's not a kind of personal thing. It's a much broader structural and institutional thing. And these attitudes go very deep. And so one thing I did in the book is I used a pretty broad set of 15 different questions on racial attitudes to try to get a very composite picture of attitudes. And when I did that, and these questions cover things like attitudes around Confederate symbols, economic inequalities along lines of race, that COVID-19, for example, has exposed so clearly, the treatment of African Americans by police and the criminal justice system. And when you ask those kinds of questions, you do see this huge gap. So, for example, white Christians of all kinds are about twice as likely as whites who are religiously unaffiliated to say, for example, that the killings of African American men by police are just isolated instances. They don't see the connections between them. They are about 30 percentage points more likely than white. So white Christians are about 30 percentage points more likely than whites who are religiously unaffiliated to say that Confederate symbols like monuments and flags are just about Southern pride and not about racism. So these are things are very, very deep. And I think the other thing that it's tied to is the changing face of the country, right? The country, as recently as 10 years ago, could still demographically be described as a white Christian country, just in terms of demographics. That's no longer true. The country's only 42% white and Christian today. And so I think that shift, and again, it's about identity and ownership of the country, I think, and that loss of kind of being dominant, I think, is really part of what we're seeing, and really partly explains white Christians' allegiance to Donald Trump, right? Who was talking about turning back the clock to a previous time, and that time is all about, I think, white Christian ownership of the country, and it's just a place that no longer reflects the reality of who we are. But I think the panic about that we're seeing among many white Christians has made it very, very difficult. But I do see an opportunity in this current moment of reckoning that we're having for a different kind of conversation. Just one quick example: the SBC president Greer recently said and said to white evangelicals, "We should be saying Black Lives Matter." Now, the fact that he had to say that, right, was exactly what you're talking about, this backlash. But he's sort of paving the way for a different kind of conversation, and one that I hope will continue.
But I think many Christians, Dr. Jones, are having a hard time and have since 2015 understanding the support of white evangelicals around Donald Trump to a fault. Even with statements that he made, the Charleston example, Charlottesville, things coming out of Charlottesville about
Yep.
there are good people on both sides, and the racial division that he has sown since he has been in office, but still his support amongst that group remains 80% or higher. So how do they justify continuing to support him when we have these images of kids in cages and so many of the other images that speak to a president that is not trying to bring the country together and suppress white supremacy, but rather is giving a platform for those kinds of attitudes?
Yeah, well, it's notable that last fall, when we asked about this, that nearly 6 in 10 Americans today say that President Trump, his words and his actions are encouraging white supremacists. Now, that's a remarkable public opinion finding about a sitting president, right? That 6 in 10 Americans say he's encouraging white supremacists, but white evangelicals and white Christians in general are more reticent to say that. And what I think it is about is I've argued that Donald Trump has really converted white Christians and white evangelicals in particular from being so-called values voters, which is the way they describe themselves, in over the last few decades, to being what I've called nostalgia voters. That is, they are voting mostly on trying to turn back the clock. One I think key finding here in the 2016 election was we asked Americans whether the American way of life and culture has changed for the better or changed for the worse since the 1950s. And it turns out the country is equally divided on that question. 2/3 of Democrats say it's changed for the better. 2/3 of Republicans say it's changed for the worse. But there are no group who say it's changed for the worse more than white evangelical Protestants. 3/4 say things have changed for the worse. Now, what is that? Brown v. Board of Education happens in the 50s, the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s. I mean, those are the defining features of American culture since that time. That really is the underlying dynamic, I think, that explains much of the attraction to Donald Trump, and that stitches together anti-immigrant policy, anti-Muslim policy, and his animosity toward African Americans. These are all of a piece of upholding a kind of white Christian America in a mythical age of the 1950s over against the way the country is changing today.
Yeah, I want to bring into this conversation Bishop Kenneth Omer. He is the author of multiple books, including Walls Can Fall, Race, Reconciliation, and Righteousness in a Divided World. He's also the pastor of Faithful Central Bible Church, one of Los Angeles's mega churches, and he happens to be a friend of mine. So glad to have him on the program this morning. Good morning, Bishop Omer. I know you've been in the green room, and we can see that you have been nodding your head with some of the comments made by Dr. Jones. And I want to have you be a part of this conversation because you had this incredible sermon that you preached that I found on YouTube, where you talk about your experiences with white evangelical preachers and congregations. So just tell us what your experience has been like, and why are you nodding your head?
You know, I felt like a bobblehead. I was just going up and down so much. And I think Dr. Jones and I ought to go on the road together because our books kind of mirror each other. And there's an interesting dynamic from the other side of his white experience of mine as a Black pastor and a Black African-American, as an African-American. The institutional dynamic, the systemic dynamic cannot be minimized. And here's what I mean by that. Having gone through, and I mentioned this in my book, having gone through predominantly white seminaries, white colleges, et cetera, Black people were nowhere in there. Church history, history of the church in America, even books of the Bible. I mean, I was 30 years old before I found out there were Black people in the Bible. But more than that, I went to schools and I had professors, I took tests and stuff and had classes where those guys who talked about the racial issue, the integration issue, those were the leftist guys. Those were guys, you don't want to go there. And so the consequences of his white journey and my Black journey through the same system is, as I said on one of my programs to our church, I feel like I cheated my church. I cheated our people because I taught what they told me. And they didn't tell me we were in there. They didn't tell me the contributions of Africans and of Black people to church history. And even in the Bible, I mean, you can't get to Acts chapter 15 and where it says there was a Black guy and never mention that. And they never told me that. They never told me that. But more than that, they said that group who emphasizes that, those are leftist guys. You don't want to go there. And so I've had to kind of repent, if you will, because I've been through the Black mirror side of what Dr. Jones was mentioning, the systemic institutional dynamic of racism, even in the church.
And what did that do for you, Bishop Omer, as someone, steeped in this, Christian theology, to learn that you had been, in many ways misinformed and taught a history that was inaccurate? How did that make you feel? And how are you now living out the truth that you have, you've come into realization of?
I felt like Malcolm. You've been hoodwinked. You've been bamboozled. I felt like the system had cheated me, and so where I am right now, and I'm 70 years old, and so I'm in this season of my life. I'm backtracking a lot, and so my thing is, as I learn it, I teach it, and as I reveal it, as it's revealed to me, I reveal it to the people, and so. And that was the journey of my book. And it's interesting that both Dr. Jones and I wrote a book that were personal. And my book gets kind of raw, because I talk about the images that I saw as a 10-year-old kid, and now I'm 70 years old, and that are still etched into my mind of racism and how it has bled over into my approach to ministry and the gaps, the holes, the things that are missing, only because I said what they told me. And rather than, I don't want to take the victim position, but I'm saying now there is a new wave. There is a new wave. It's interesting that George Barnard just did a survey and found out that 62% of white churches, white pastors, have made a statement about racism since George Floyd. But 30%, less than 30%, are described as being actively engaged in anti-racism. That's interesting. I have white friends who have lost members because they've talked about racism. I have I guess everybody's heard about the guy, I think was somewhere in the South, who got fired, kicked out of his church for talking about racism. So it is still alive and well, and it's in the churches of, I was going to say on Sunday morning, but we can't meet right now, but it is systemically involved in the very nature of the church, even as we speak. Is it changing gradually? Yes, like the statement about the SBC president right now. But I suggest that is an anomaly. My friend Joel Osteen, that's Joel's heart. Joel is sincere about that. But
Mhm.
trust me, Joe is not leading a movement, and there's a sense in which he's out there by himself. As it relates to the political thing, I say this: when Obama was president, he could do nothing right. Now that Trump is president, the conservative, the white wing, right wing conservative church, he can do no wrong. No matter what he says, he can. Nobody calls him on it, and it still exists today.
An excellent point, Bishop Omer. I want to ask Dr. Jones about that, because that's my sense too, is that the white evangelical church won't call Trump out even when he makes egregious statements or engages in conduct that we know, had Obama engaged in, he would have been, you know, raced out of the White House, driven out of the White House, would have been the worst thing ever. So how are they turning a blind eye and continue to turn a blind eye to this kind of conduct?
Well, there's clearly a double standard here. There's no doubt about it. And what's remarkable is that prior to 2016 and prior to his election, there actually were more white evangelical voices willing to say things like, "Look, if supporting Trump is what it means to be evangelical, I'm out." But most of those voices have been silenced since he was elected president, and we don't see as many of those anymore. In fact, Al Mohler, who was an anti-Trump person in 2016, has now come out and endorsed Trump for 2020, who's the president of Southern Seminary, the oldest Southern Baptist seminary in the country. Again, one I think, to show you how I think deep this is, we asked a question about candidates' character and how much it mattered. And we asked this question in 2011, so way back, right in the middle of Obama's term. And the question said, can someone who commits an immoral act in their private life still behave ethically and perform their duties in their public life? Now, back in 2011, only 30% of white evangelicals said that that was possible, right? Which is what you would expect from a group that considers themselves values voters and thinks that character carries over into public life and matters. We asked this question again in 2016 with Trump at the top of the ticket, and it went from 30% to 72% who said this was possible, right? There's just been a whole flip in political ethics here, that moving from an ethic of principle where we say we're going to hold everyone to the same standard and let the chips fall where they may, to really an ends justifies the means kind of political ethic, where no, we have a commitment to this candidate Donald Trump, and the means really don't matter. We'll reevaluate our political ethics along the way with this end certainly in place. One quick comment I want to make on sort of thinking about white religious leaders standing up. I think the proof is in the pudding going forward about whether preaching a sermon translates into action. Right? That's really what's going to matter, right? You could preach a sermon and move on. That's a pretty easy thing to do. But one of the things I've been saying, and I say in the book, is that I think white Christians should really stop talking about racial reconciliation, and they should just talk about racial justice. And if they talk about and they walk the walk on racial justice, reconciliation will come. But to aim directly for reconciliation, I think, is often an attempt at fairly cheap grace and a quick apology, and really, window dressing on the status quo.
Well, let me ask you this, Doctor, and I'll let you make your comment, Bishop Omer, but I want to ask you, Dr. Jones, we often hear the white church justifying their support around Trump, saying they are, focused on particular issues like abortion. Yep. Like support for conservative justices on, the federal bench, and that they can hold their noses, they can, overlook the affairs, they can overlook adultery, they can overlook the character issues because, they're so focused on those issues. Are we to believe that, that's just, those are just excuses that they are, putting forth to really hide or masquerade something that's a lot deeper?
In short, that's my take. That, for example, when we ask questions on, there's evidence for this. When we ask questions about what are the most important voting issues to you in an election, I have never, in my more than a decade of conducting national public opinion surveys, I have never seen a survey that showed abortion or same-sex marriage in the top 3 voting issues, even among white Christians in the country. So, I think in many ways, these issues are easier issues to talk about than to talk about their stands on race and racism. And if you really look at the history of how our two political parties came to be what they are, the defining moment really is the Civil Rights Acts in the mid 1960s. That's where we get the whites fleeing the Democratic Party, joining the Republican Party, and by Reagan's election, they're there. And that reaction to civil rights, with the Democratic Party being affiliated with civil rights and whites fleeing the party over that only took about a generation to happen. And today, self-identified Republicans are about 70% white and Christian. Self-identified Democrats are about 30% white and Christian, and that gap continues to get bigger. But the driving force between the political polarization we have today really is reaction to the civil rights movements in the mid 1960s.
Go ahead, Bishop Bowman. You wanted to make a point?
Yeah, I think we're making the same point, that there's a historic systemic element here, that it's almost like the rules of the games are shifting. It used to be thought that this party was the party of ethics, the party of character, the party of strong personality and strong commitments, that kind of thing. And then all of a sudden, those things don't matter anymore. They mattered when there was a president of color. They mattered historically, but now it's like Dr. Jones said, it's like those things no longer matter. The things that I have a friend who stood up in his pulpit about a month or so after the George Floyd thing and talked about justice and racism and everything. He lost members, and this is the huge church here in Southern California, because they said we don't want to hear that. So Dr. Jones hit it right on the head. To say a sermon, to make a statement, to do a prayer, is one thing, but those same guys and women, particularly guys, but those same guys, after they've done that, that's the benediction. We're done. We're done. And so there's no activity, there's no involvement, there's no sustaining, there's no continuity. And so I think there are those. A friend of mine talks about the fact of making statements like that is like sanitizing your conscience. We did something, we said something. Now let's go back to business as usual. And therein lies the inconsistency.
Absolutely. I want to ask you this, Dr. Jones, before I bring in my next guest. We talk about character, and I think we'd all agree, the three of us would agree, that if you do this survey, if Joe Biden becomes the president and takes the White House, takes the office in 2020, you do that survey again, issues of character, probably you'll see those numbers flip, and 70% of them will say that character does matter. So we know and we see the hypocrisy there. It's very transparent. But I want to ask you, Dr. Jones, what are some of the Trump character moments you would say that are the most contrary to church teachings?
Well, I think we've seen some very recently. I think his inability, for example, to show up at John Lewis's funeral, just his inability to say anything really about John Lewis. And even when he was point blank asked about it, the main thing he can say about John Lewis is that he didn't show up to his inauguration, right? So not being able to speak to someone who's laid down their life, risked their life from the time they were a young adult and all through a very well-lived life, inability to say something praiseworthy for someone like that, I think is key. I think also his very clear pattern, you mentioned it earlier, of wink and nod to white supremacy. I mean, there is just his inability to call it out cleanly, saying there are very fine people on both sides. In Charlottesville, when you had people chanting neo-Nazi slogans like blood and soil and Jews will not replace us, and his inability to call that out. And then I think we see it in some kind of, really ham-fisted and awkward ways in which he uses Christianity as a tool. So for example, when he cleared the peaceful protesters and he marched across the street to a Protestant church and awkwardly held up this Bible, and really, and he didn't he didn't read the Bible, he didn't open it to a scripture passage. He just held it up as a symbol and then tried to talk about law and order, right? I mean, that's old racist language, back from the 1960s. So I think even these kind of awkward ways in which it's just so transparently using Christianity as a tool, that I think we can just see the thinness of it in those kinds of responses.
I want to bring in my next guest. He's been listening also in the green room, and he is Pastor Mark Burns. He is the pastor of Harvest Praise and Worship Center in South Carolina. He's a co-founder and CEO of the Now TV network, and he's been described by Time magazine as Donald Trump's top pastor. Good morning, Pastor
Good
Burns.
morning to you.
Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been in the green room. You've had a chance to listen to the conversation I've been having with Dr. Jones and Bishop Kenneth Omer. I just want to ask you, there is this consensus in the country, particularly amongst African Americans, that Donald Trump is fueling the rise of white supremacists. The Southern California Law Center says there's been a 55% increase in hate groups since he's been in office. You, as an African American pastor who is a surrogate for the president, you've traveled with him, obviously, you've been on the road campaigning for him, speaking in favor of the president. How do you reconcile what we hear coming out of the president's mouth and your support for him?
Well, I want to tell you, this is extremely troubling times in our nation, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. We are extremely divided, and I believe without a shadow of a doubt that this is not the will of the Lord in reference to how we're so divided amongst each other. I think this panel, at least how it was given to me, is about Christianity and Black Lives Matter. And, I believe in Black Lives Matter. Clearly, I believe in Black Lives Matter. I'm a Black man from the deep South of South Carolina. And again, just one generation before my grandfather, having had a flaming cross in his yard by the KKK here in Belton, South Carolina, because my grandmother was too light skinned and they thought she was a white woman. And so until they discovered she was mixed, they left them alone. And so, these are the stories that I grew up with in my home. And so I clearly understand the challenge that we have as Black Americans in this country, even now in 2020. For me, it's just bigger than race. I believe, and to go to answer some of the questions that was being asked about why white evangelicals have a challenge admitting to Black Lives Matter. I mean, of course, the Bible makes it very clear that Black Lives Matter. In Genesis, the Bible said God created all human beings. And so he makes it very clear that as Christians, we should stand against any form of racism in this country. The challenge that has happened is Black Lives Matter, the political entity, has taken on positions that are completely contrary, to the gospel of Jesus Christ, which prevents people who.
Let me stop you right there, Pastor Burns. What are you talking about when you say they've taken on positions that are contrary to the gospel of Jesus Christ? What have they taken on that's contrary to the gospel? Black Lives Matter is about promoting racial equality in this country and raising, the issue of systemic racism, how it has plagued pretty much every institution
Sure.
in this country, from policing to banking. So, what are the policies that are contrary to Christian theology?
Well, for those who are not astute to the Black Lives Matter movement, which is extremely led not just by a political party, but it's also connected to a lifestyle. We're talking about how the Black Lives Matter movement, not the term Black Lives Matter, because literally God created all human beings. And again, as I stated, Christians, let me get to my point. Let me get to my point. Let me get to my point. Thank you
Well,
so
first
much.
of all, you said those who are not astute. I just want to make it clear for the record that wouldn't be anyone on this panel. So
right. Well, we're not talking about just the people on your panel. We're talking about to the audience that is listening and watching us talk, or listening to those who will be watching this broadcast. But again, let me get to my point. Black Lives Matter, not the term Black Lives Matter, because again, as I clearly stated, as Christians, we should stand against racism, because literally Black lives do matter, which God created all life. Therefore, all of our lives that matter. We also understand that Black people in America specifically are more likely to be killed by police and still have a challenge of success even in 2020. The point that I was making in reference to the organization Black Lives Matter, the group that is connected and partnered itself with leftists of our nation, and it has engrafted itself. They march hand in hand. They march side by side with organizations that are contrary or ideals that are contrary to the gospel. Number one, abortion is a sin. I believe abortion should not be taking place. I believe that in Jeremiah, the Bible makes it very clear that God. Well,
Stop
let
you
me
right there.
no, hold on, let me hold on, time out,
No,
because
no,
I'm
time out.
let me say this, because
No.
you asked me to come on this show. I've been very respectful. I've been very kind. I
Yeah, but
watch you talk to every other person on the panel. You've been
no,
very kind. Bishop Umer, who I met, I love him dearly. He's a great man of God. I
go
respect and
ahead.
honor
Go ahead. I'm
him.
gonna let
You
you
let
finish. Go ahead.
everybody speak,
Go ahead. You have
because because you don't disagree with their point. When you start cutting me
Go
off,
ahead.
you're not
Go
letting me
ahead.
complete my full statement. So we spend another 2 minutes while you trying to overtalk me and cut me off. You know, I hadn't even got to the
Sure.
question that you asked me, which is disrespectful, because I come on with the mentality that,
Pastor Burns, I don't want to disrespect you. Go
okay.
ahead. Finish
All
your
right.
point.
So if you just give me the same honor you gave Bishop Ullman, whom I love and I appreciate, I would appreciate that, even if you disagree. Okay. So the point that I was simply trying to make is Black Lives Matter, the organization. This is why it's challenging, not just for white evangelicals. And I agree with you. I 100% agree with you that even amongst white evangelicals, it is challenging for some of them to recognize the challenges that Black people have even to this day. I agree that we have challenges, but I also think that we should be focused on other areas, and police brutality is not the number one issue that's hurting our people. Okay. You're a host of a national television show. I own the second largest Black African American Christian TV network in America today. And we both are success in our own right. Bishop Umer pastors one of the largest churches in California, and is a best time selling author. He is a very successful preacher and man of God. I had the privilege of meeting him once at a convention. And so, but we still do have challenges, and police brutality for those of us, that's not the issue. But I'm going to get to that. Let me just get to what I was originally trying to say before you rudely interrupted me, which was why some people have issues saying Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter walk hand in hand with ideologies that are contrary to the Word of God, which is abortion. Number one, abortionists believe that, even though we're talking about lives, Black Lives Matter, Black baby lives really don't matter. When we kill our own, we destroy our own babies. We even now, Planned Parenthood has distanced themselves from Margaret Sanger, because now, we all know that she was a racist, and so now they're trying to downplay it officially that she really isn't the person, the person that we are celebrating, even though we understand that Planned Parenthood was designed to systematically kill Black babies and to start the growth of our people. And we carry that on even today. But as believers, we should know, especially those of us who are pastors and carriers of the gospel of Jesus Christ, leaders should be standing behind, should not be connected to any organization that will openly kill children, that would openly allow babies to die, when we know in Jeremiah, God knew us before he formed us in the womb of the mother. And then all of that, they're destroying what Black Lives Matter and the liberal left, the socialist left, have connected and have hijacked. And that's the word that I use. They have hijacked the modern civil rights movement. They have hijacked the days of Dr. King and Dr. Abernathy, and those of Medgar Evers, who gave his life in Mississippi, and those who have marched, and those countless folks that don't have statues built for them. They believe in the moral standards, and they were the mouthpiece. They would have never stood behind abortion. They would have never stood behind same-sex marriage. They believed in civil rights and the advancement of Black people in America. But what has happened today is it has become twisted and engrafted, and it's challenging for people who believe that the gospel is more important than the color of my skin. Just like I give a prime example of the NBA basketball player who just simply made national headlines because he refused to take a
Pastor
knee.
Burns, let me stop you. I want to get Bishop Omer to comment on what you just said.
Let me finish that last statement. That last statement is this: the basketball player who refused to take a knee because he's a preacher, he's a man of God, he's a minister of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and he says, I'm not against Black Lives Matter. I'm 100% behind Black Lives Matter. Just like Mark Burns, I'm 100% Black Lives Matter and the advancement of colored people in this country. But I believe that it should be handled and solved with the gospel of Jesus Christ, not by taking a knee in the national anthem, but by simply saying we got to show and introduce the love of God. In the Galatians 5, the Bible says that we should love ourselves as we love our neighbors.
Okay,
Jesus called it the
Mr.
greatest
Burns, we're going to run
commandment.
out of time. I got to get Bishop Omer in. I want to have Bishop Omer respond to what you said about Black Lives Matter and why some white evangelicals may have a problem with
And
the word.
black.
Yeah, I think that some and Dr. Burns, good to see you again, was just about to say the same thing. There are some issues. I think there is a support for the declaration of Black Lives Matters that may not be a support of the organization.
Mhm.
Declaration, the value of Black lives, indisputable. You can't argue about that. I guess, and I didn't know that that Dr. Burns was in the middle of that circle. I know several white friends of mine who are also in the circle, the religious circle that surrounds the president. And my observation now, knowing that you were one of the guys there, maybe you're like Esther and you're there for such a time as this. I always wonder, where do you have his ear? Can you guys yank his chain? The stuff that he says, the positions that he takes, I'm saying you guys have gotten the favor to be in there. Who's saying anything? Because I know my white friends who are in there, and I know guys who have this personal telephone number, and they're friends of mine. But they say two things, little and nothing. So I always wondered, and I just didn't know, I always wondered, do you guys have the entree to say, hey, man, that's wrong. Hey, you got to back that up. Hey, you got to correct that. Do you guys have his ear, now that you have his entree?
Bishop Omer, and I want to say
Question,
this.
Dr. Bishop Omer. Pastor Burns, do you have an opportunity to say to Donald Trump, he's wrong when he's wrong, when he makes a statement that, is wink and nod, and sometimes not even a dog whistle to white supremacists? Do you have the president's ear on issues like that?
Without a shadow of a doubt, I can give you a promise up. Bishop Omer, again, it's great to see you again too. To give you a promise, my whole life changed. I'm gonna try to be as brief as possible because I don't want to take too much of your time, and I want to honor that. But when I first met Donald Trump in 2015, I was asked to come up with other evangelical leaders, and of course, Jan Crouch was there, Dr. David Jeremiah, so many other white evangelical leaders were there. Bishop Clarence McClendon, Bishop Bloomer, and Darrell Scott was there as well, and of course myself. And so in this conversation, I went on record saying this, it's in my book as I'm writing it, that in this conversation, so many of the other leaders that were there, they were just so happy to be in the room that they were, talking about how great Donald Trump is. Of course, I didn't know him at the time. I just simply made a question that changed my whole life, which is why 4 years later, I'm still talking to the media to this day, which was this. Mr. Trump, many of us African-American leaders took hell just for even coming to this meeting. What will be your goal to bridge the gap between the Black community, the Republican Party, and yourself? That one question changed the whole dynamic of our meeting, and that's what led me on to this point, to this day. That even now, yes, I have the ear of the president. Yes, I do share. I've made it very clear that I really hate that the statement was made about Representative John Lewis. This man has bled for our nation, bled for the civil rights movement. It was very disappointing to me that you did not speak. And of course, he boycotted your inauguration, but you're the president. You are the president of the United States of America, and a bridge builder. And so, yes, I do speak to that. I do speak whenever there's when something bothers me. That's why I'm still there, because I tell what I believe is dear to my heart. But just like any pastor, I would never abandon someone, even though they may act a certain way that I disagree with. If they still honor me as their shepherd, or honor me as a shepherd, or a voice in their life, then I will speak, thus saith the Lord, to whomsoever will. And still be there unless they deny the Christ thereof. And then if they deny the Christ thereof and start preaching something that's completely disagreement, that Jesus is Messiah, then I have to treat them as an infidel and cut them off and lead them to the hands of the Holy Spirit. But like the president, I do absolutely speak. I do speak up, and I have one on record, and I've said it throughout the ages. When the president says something I think is not a statement that should be made by the commander-in-chief of this country and by the leader of the free world, I make that very clear. And I'm happy that the president gives me that platform. I'm happy the president gives me that access to his administration, to his White House, and to be able to speak, thus saith the Lord. And the president receives many of the things that has been said, many things that leaders pour into his heart, many of the prayers that are happening privately. Obviously, he's still a growing, progressive Christian. And I can tell you personally, he desires to be a bridge builder. But again, I'm just going to say this, and I'm going to say it again on record. The statement that was made in reference to Representative John Lewis, I was extremely disappointed. What an amazing opportunity that could have been a bridge builder and to bring everybody together, and to really begin to heal some of the wounds that is tearing our country apart. So
Thank
I
you for
understand.
that, Pastor Burns, because African Americans and all Americans were very, very upset and disappointed that the president could not bring himself to say something positive about John Lewis, and that he resorted to, well, he didn't come to my party. But I know Dr. Jones has been sitting there wanting to jump into this conversation. So go ahead, Dr. Jones. I know you have a point you wanted to make.
Great. Well, Pastor Burns, glad to be with you. I haven't been with you before, so glad to have the opportunity here. So I would say this, one of the things that I do want to respond to, though, because I think it came up in my research and my own experience growing up as a white evangelical Christian. One of the biggest challenges, I think, is that white evangelicals are very quick to use some of the language that Pastor Burns used. That is to flatly declare that something is antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? To make this blanket statement about this issue against the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I want to just sort of put a pause on that, because one of the things that came up over and over and over again is that same theological perspective that is declaring, for example, abortion to be against the gospel of Jesus Christ, was the same theological perspective that declared slavery to be absolutely compatible with Christianity and with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I write in the book, and again, this is something as a believer and as someone who grew up and shaped and formed in this church, how appalling it was to me to really realize this, and to realize the way I put it in the book is that, look, if we're honest about it, the Jesus that most white churches conjured, evangelical, mainline, even Catholic, through most of American history, was a Jesus that was not only just fine with white supremacy and slavery, but in fact demanded it as part of what the gospel was about and part of what God's design for human society was to be about. You hear that in the prayers that the founder of the Southern Baptist Convention, Basil Manley Sr., prayed as he was blessing the Confederacy. He was the chaplain of the Confederacy, and it was also the guy holding the Bible at Jefferson Davis's thing. And one of the things I hope for the book is that white evangelicals and those kind of representing President Trump's base would really take a deep drink at the well of humility after getting this wrong for so many years, and to sort of have a better sense of humility about what the gospel of Jesus Christ does and doesn't, what is and isn't compatible with that, and would not be so quick to declare that their political opponents are outside of the gospel of Jesus Christ, given this very, very troubling history.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I heard, Pastor Burns, did you see, or were you listening when Dr. Jones talked about the survey that was done amongst white evangelicals, and how under Donald Trump, 30% of those evangelicals were willing to basically, pretty much dismiss character issues, where before Donald Trump was elected, issues of character were much more important to that constituency. So how are we to reconcile what appears to be situational, where they're willing to throw all of their teachings about ethics out the window in order to accommodate Donald Trump?
Well, I don't think it's just about Donald Trump. I think this is the book of Revelations coming to pass. I mean, the Bible makes it very clear that there will be a time where right becomes wrong and wrong becomes right. Again, I think that we need to deal with this thing the way we, as pastors and bishops of the Lord's church, students of the gospel of Jesus Christ, leaders of the gospel of Jesus Christ, should spend more time fighting the real enemy. The enemy is not Donald Trump. The enemy is not racism. The enemy is not white evangelicals. The enemy most definitely is not Black Lives Matter, the phrase, and I agree with Bishop Umer, the phrase or the organization. The enemy is from the gates of hell. And what saddens me is that I don't hear many leaders, not many. There's some that will be bold enough to say this, but the enemy is from the gates of hell. His name is Lucifer, Beelzebub. We call him Satan. And that we understand that those of us who are leaders of the gospel of Jesus Christ, that have the truth, that we preach this from our pulpits, from our television broadcasts. I teach to over 236 million homes every Sunday around the world on satellite television and cable television. And I stand there and I tell people that the blood of Jesus is the truth, it is the light, and that no man can come to the Father except through the Son. And that we preach and teach that Jesus declared the two greatest commandments is to, one, love your God with all your heart and all your mind. The second greatest of this is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. That's the message that we need to be teaching to whites, to blacks, to Muslims, to Jews, to anyone that does not believe in the love of Jesus Christ, that we teach that and we show that amongst each other. And we don't try to politicize it. I'm not there behind Donald Trump because he is the president of the United States of America. I was asked years ago to help be a voice of God to this man. And that's my position. I can't speak for everyone else. I agree with some things, I disagree with some things, but for me, the canon is the gospel of Jesus Christ. And until we start having more leaders who will call that demon out, that demonic spirit out of racism, that demonic spirit out of division, not trying to analyze why Donald Trump didn't speak against the very fine people in Charlottesville. No, we got to go back to the real enemy, and the enemy is Satan. And it is on our knees in prayer. It is using the word of God and calling upon the name of Jesus Christ that we proclaim as leaders of the gospel of Jesus, that we have power to tread over every serpent that rises up against us. And so that's been my message to leaders. Yes, we're involved in politics. We have to be, because we're of this world. Yes, we have to deal with some of these issues because we're in this world. But for those of us who know without a shadow of a doubt that Jesus is Messiah, he died on the cross, he rose 3 days later, and he's coming back again with omnipotent power in his hands, that be the message that supersedes whether you're a white evangelical Christian, whether you're a black evangelical Christian, whether you're a believer or not. The Bible says all knees shall bow and all tongues shall confess. And then we're going to get to your one last point is this, and last point is this, is that the talk about, and how my dear brother, Dr. Please forgive me for missing your name, but my eloquent pastor who spoke, and what he said was absolutely right. The same gospels that we call to be the truth, white evangelicals use that as a tool to keep black people enslaved in the time, and they use that to justify. But we also know that Satan himself used the very same scriptures when he tempted Jesus. Satan himself knows the word of God. Satan himself even repeated the word of God. Just because they used the word of God doesn't mean that they were right. Their spirits were wrong, and they used it for their own advantage. Satan did the same thing.
I think we understand your point. I want to get Bishop Omer to respond to that, because Pastor Burns says that we need to be thinking bigger than that these issues are bigger than racism. But when we see a Minneapolis ex-police cop kneeling on George Floyd's neck, and we know that African Americans are twice as likely to be killed by police than white Americans, and we see the systemic racism that exists in this country, how can we say that leaders need to be focused on anything other than rooting out racism? And if you have the pulpit, if you have 236 million people that you have an opportunity to talk to, seems like there's nothing more important that you can be talking to those people about than addressing issues of systemic racism. Pastor Bishop Omer, have a mega church here in Los Angeles, and I can't believe that you would get in that pulpit and ignore what happened to George Floyd, or ignore what happens to African American men in this country every day.
Here's my fear, and it does relate to what my friend Pastor Burns says. Here's my fear. So let's zoom the lens out and let's get to the spiritual, the satanic dynamic, and all that kind of stuff. My fear is, and has anybody ever questioned that maybe, just maybe as an outside chance, maybe there is one who sits in that big White House who may also be a target of that satanic force that we're all fighting. Absolutely. To turn back the hands of time, to take us back to where we've tried to come so far from. And with those of us with spiritual discernment, is anybody got the right to pull this guy to the side in the bathroom, in the hall, whatever, and at least point that out? I have friends, who were on that same committee, Dr. Bernard and others who were there, and I have white friends also who said, he won't listen to us. He won't listen to us. And so what I'm saying is, I think you guys are there for such a time as this, man. And I'm saying, so if we zoom it out to the spiritual dynamic of the possible use of Satan in this mix, does anybody recognize that he may also be unknowingly, unwittingly, if to give him the benefit of the doubt, being used as a tool to turn back the hands of time, like Dr. Jones says, to those who thought they were standing up for Jesus when they stood up for slavery, to those who may be doing something similar to that today. I'm just wondering again, when you guys put that before him, does he hear you? Because whatever you guys are saying, it doesn't come out when the cameras are rolling. That's all I'm saying. And I'm saying you've got the favor to be in there. And I'm wondering how much influence you guys have. And if you do, yank the man's chain, man.
Mm-hmm. And Bishop, and I want to tell you,
Pastor Burns, I'm gonna let you comment, but I want to ask Dr. Jones something. So, Donald Trump just had this very difficult interview with Axios on HBO. And, he struggled with a lot of things, obviously not being able to recognize the greatness of John Lewis and to recognize his incredible sacrifice in terms of fighting for voting rights and civil rights for this country. But he said that he had never sat down with Black Lives Matter, and he said they never asked him to do so. Do you think, given this moment that we're in, this moment of reckoning, of racial reckoning in this country, this moment where Black Lives Matter protests have been, documented as the largest protest movement probably in the history of this country, and Black Lives Matter now is being universally accepted by 60-70% of people, and white people are starting to recognize it in disproportionate numbers that there is a race problem in this country, even though Donald Trump has not acknowledged it and does not acknowledge systemic racism, nor does Attorney General Barr. He won't acknowledge it as it relates to police departments. And we have this administration that has turned, as you talked about, a blind eye to the racial problems in this country. Do you think it would do any good, and maybe Pastor Mark is our man, Pastor Burns, to facilitate a meeting with Black Lives Matter, with the likes of a Bishop Omer, with the likes of a Dr. Jones, with the likes of Pastor Mark Burns, who does have the ears, been on the private jet with the president? Would that kind of meeting do any good in this moment? Or should we just be looking towards November?
Look, I'm going to have to make this brief because I have to jump off, unfortunately. But I think a meeting with Black Lives Matter should be a non-negotiable, it should be a no-brainer for a sitting president in this moment. It's a matter of paying attention to the pulse of the country, of understanding the pain, of understanding the disappointment, of understanding the injustice in the country. And President Trump has even tried to muddy the waters around that by saying, well, more white people get killed by police. And instead of really looking, if you look at it proportionally, African Americans are 2.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police. If you look at it as a proportion of the population, which is the proper way to look at it. So I think, beyond denying the facts, but sitting down and just listening, right? Just listening would be a huge balm on the wounds that the country is experiencing. But instead, we have had, I talked about the Confederate flag as free speech, hasn't sat down with the movement leaders. And I think that just has to be something that any president concerned about the racial reckoning and the racial pain in this country would have to take seriously. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to jump off. Have that be my last word.
We're out of time, and I want to thank you, Dr. Jones. I want to thank you, Pastor Burns, and thank you, Bishop Omer. Incredibly important conversation. Just starting to scratch the surface on these issues. But again, thank you all for your, being a part of today's show, and thank you for your voice on these issues. Woo, okay. I always say on the special report, we're tackling those issues that a lot of folks don't want to touch, because these are complicated issues when you talk about race. And then you start talking about race and religion. boy, you're talking about, really going deep into some issues that are incredibly complicated, and for a lot of people, really painful, having to confront the past, and having to confront what they have been taught, for years, from generations, from their parents and their grandparents, and really having to question their own theology and the underpinning of their theology. So again, thanks to my guests, because they are all, have a lot to say and big opinions about these issues. Thanks to all of you for joining me for this incredible conversation. You can continue to be a part of the conversation. Follow me at Ariva Martin. Thanks to our sponsor. Thanks to my incredible production team. We know, again, just a couple, last words. White Southern Baptists opposed the civil rights movement, and many Christian denominations before defended and legitimized slavery, and white Christianity has never existed, according to Dr. Jones, apart from the global color line, but rather it is deeply implicated in both creating and sustaining it. And no matter how you slice it, Donald Trump has been the sustainer in chief. And it won't be easy to eradicate, the United States of white supremacists, or to cause those evangelicals who uphold them to confront their complicity in maintaining structures of hate. But hopefully, biblical scholars and social scientists like Robert Jones and pastors like Bishop Kenneth Omer will continue to challenge those white evangelicals. And maybe pastors like Mark Burns, who have the ear of the president, can continue to yank his chain, as Bishop Omer encourages him to do so. But we can't keep denying this country's racist past, and Christianity and Christians can't continue to deny the racist past, and we can't continue to turn a blind eye to present day systemic racism. In this critical moment in our history, where millions of protesters are on the streets fighting for racial justice, there's no room for silence. There's no room for inaction or tired excuses wrapped in theological principles that were formulated in the segregated South. In this moment, now more than ever, we need all Christians to embrace biblical principles of love thy neighbor, not just thy Republican neighbors, but all of thy neighbors. We need Christians to embrace faith, not fear, hope, not hate, and love, and definitely not the lies that we hear every day out of this White House. Y'all be safe out there. Don't forget to wear your mask. And remember, we are all in this together.